say a prayer, an opening prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. We praise you, Father, and friend of all people. With Mary, your Son's disciples, received the gift of your Spirit as they remained firm in unity and prayer. We bless your name for gathering us together as brothers and sisters. Renew your love in our hearts and keep us strong in friendship. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. I looked at all of the writings about Father's background, and I found one that I'll touch on most of it, but not all of it. There's so much. And I want to thank everyone for coming to our April Secular Servite meeting, and we're very honored that you're here. Father John Pawlikowski is a Servite priest and professor of social ethics at the Catholic Theological Union. He is a founding member of the United States Holocaust Memorial Council, having been appointed by Jimmy Carter in 1980, reappointed to the council by President George Bush and President Bill Clinton. He currently chairs the council's Subcommittee on Church Relations and serves on its Executive Committee, Committee on Conscience, and the Academic Committee. Father has authored 10 books. He's contributed to a number of volumes focusing on interreligious dialogue and reflection of remembrance. He's an editor of the New Theology Review and a member of boards and so much. Father is a member of the Advisory Committee on Catholic Jewish Relations, National Conference of Catholic Bishops. He serves on the National Advisory Council of the Polish Institute of Arts and Sciences, is vice president of the National Association for Polish Jewish Studies, co-chair, National Polish American Jewish American Council, and advisory committee member, Polish Studies program at Indiana University. His awards include the Raoul Wallenberg Humanitarian Award for Distinguished Contributions to Religious, the Distinguished Service Award from the American Jewish Committee, the Person of the Year Award from the Polish Council of Christians and Jews in Warsaw, and the Nostra Aetate Award from the Archdiocese of Chicago. And Father did Father Joe wrote an article that Father received an award and had a private reception with the Pope in June, which is wonderful. Anyway, we want to thank you very much for being here, and
Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm happy to share some thoughts with you regarding what I thought I would do is give you, first of all, some indication of the complexity and structure of Islam as a global religion. And then I would try to highlight a few of the major beliefs, and then go a little bit into the Catholic-Muslim dialogue as it has developed both in this country and globally in the contemporary church. But let me begin just by saying most of my work historically in interreligious has focused on Catholic-Jewish relations, Christian-Jewish relations. However, in recent years, I've been increasingly involved in Christian-Jewish-Muslim relations and even in bilateral relations between the Islamic community and the Catholic Church, the larger Christian community. Most recently, for example, I had an opportunity to be a special guest for Friday prayers at the Islamic Center in Nashville, Tennessee. My institution, Catholic Theological Union, has had a program called In Good Faith, which is Christian, Jewish, Muslim for quite a number of years now. In fact, it's being awarded an honor by the Chicago, the Leadership Council of of religious leaders in metropolitan Chicago, and that's coming up in June. So I've had an opportunity also increasingly to share discussions with Muslim leaders, professionals, and so on. So that's just to indicate that even though, as I say, my special focus has been on Christian-Jewish relations, I've had a fair amount of exposure and involvement in Christian-Muslim relations as well. Now, the makeup of the Islamic community. You probably, from reading your newspapers, listening to television, have heard the terms Sunni and Shiite, okay? And those are really the two major groupings within the world Islamic community. About 80% of all Muslims in the world are in fact Sunnis. Numerically, this makes up about 1.05 billion people. So by far, in terms of the world, the Sunnis are the strong majority. About 13%, or 170 million, are Shiites. But the Shiites, and this is important in recent political developments, the Shiites are in fact the majority in countries such as Iran, Iraq, Bahrain, Yemen, and Azerbaijan. And they are the largest religious group in Lebanon. So even though numerically they're much smaller, nonetheless they exercise a very, very profound influence in some very, very key areas of political conflict right now in the world. Now, what is the difference between the Shiites and the Sunnis? It really comes down to one reality. For the Sunnis, they take their basic teachings directly from the revelations of Muhammad as recorded in the Quran. So if you want, they could see themselves as following in a kind of pure way the teachings directly given by Muhammad. The Shiites, on the other hand, certainly follow the teachings of Muhammad, but they do so through the interpretations of one of the later caliphs, a caliph named Ali, who interpreted some of the teachings of Muhammad and gave them, in some cases, a bit of a different nuance and so on. So they kind of, yes, they follow Muhammad, but they follow Muhammad through the interpretive lens given by this fellow Ali, okay? So that is really the fundamental difference. In practice, there isn't all that much discrepancy between the two in terms of what they actually practice and believe, but they did have forged separate identities. And that's why I think you now see some of the intense conflict between the Shia and the Sunnis in many parts of the world. Now, there are also other groups of Muslims. The third largest group would be the Sufis. You may have heard of Sufis. Now, Sufis are both Shiites and Sunnis. They cross the divide. Their basic orientation is very mystical. And so they are really the mystics of Islam. But in being the mystics, they don't always have a rigid approach to the letter of the law. And therefore, many of the Shiites and Sunnis sort of disdain them for not being rather lax in observance of Quranic principles and Quranic teaching, because their focus is not so much on precise teachings as it is on a kind of spiritual experience. I should mention that oftentimes when you run into Muslim converts, I mean, people who have converted, say, in many cases from Christianity to Islam, whether here in the United States or in parts of Europe, they often embrace the Sunni philosophy because in one way it's easier, it's less demanding in terms of rigid adherence to the Quranic legislation. Now, there are also a couple of other, you might call them sectarian groups. There are three of them in particular. Two of them are very similar. One is the Wahhabis. The Wahhabis are a very, very strict group of Muslims that basically dominate Saudi Arabia. That is really their principal place. And they do not really regard either the Shiites or the Sunnis as really totally faithful adherents, and do not allow for much space for other non-Wahhabi practice of Islam. Another very close to the Wahhabis are the Salafis. You may have heard that term recently because they've become an important electoral bloc in certain countries like Egypt. And Egypt would be one of their areas of strength. Now, the Salafis are they also are quite a strict sect. They're fundamentally the same as the Wahhabis, but they have a few distinctive beliefs. But where they joined the Wahhabis is in a very, very strict interpretation of Islam. Perhaps neither one is quite as strict as what ISIS argues for. Many Muslim scholars do not, frankly, consider ISIS a legitimate Islamic expression. I mean, they're Muslims, but as far as their teachings and so on, whether Sunni or Shiites, do not necessarily see ISIS they see it as a political movement that's using Islam, but not necessarily some movement that should be classed as an authentic interpretation of the Islamic tradition. So that's somewhat of the makeup of the Muslim community globally. Now, I should make the point, because it's often misunderstood, the majority of Muslims are not Arabs. And so one should never equate in a simplistic way Islam with Arab. Now, I can understand why some people do that, because when all is said and done, the majority of sacred shrines of Islam are located in Muslim countries. The largest single Muslim country is, in fact, Indonesia. So it's and the non-Arabic Muslims often have, again, not a totally different interpretation of the Quran, but they have, in many cases, taken on a new culturally based interpretation of the Quran that fits more into their own geographic and cultural setting. And we're also experiencing, and this is particularly true in parts of Europe, including, and especially including the United Kingdom, we are witnessing, according to some Muslims with whom I have spoken, some imams, the emergence of what they call an Islamic third force. Now, what do I mean by that? In many of the mosques, including, for example, the largest mosque in London, the Central Mosque in London, we see people coming to that mosque from India, from Pakistan, from Arab countries, and so on. And in the course of coming together, they are actually forging a kind of new interpretation almost of the Islamic tradition set in a European context. So they do not nicely identify with either the classical divisions of Sunni Shiite, and so on, because there is this kind of coming together and sort of, as some of imams would say, the emergence of a sort of third force of Islam, at this point, largely based in Europe, but also some of that kind of development is also taking place within Islamic communities here in North America. Now, just a little bit more on the makeup of the Islamic community, and not so much on a religious basis, but maybe on a social-political basis. There are two major Islamic organizations here in the United States. And one might add a third, and I'll say that, mention that in a moment. But the two are the Islamic Society of North America, known usually as ISNA, and CARE, the Committee for American Islamic Relations. CARE is more of a secular group that embraces business people, professional people, and so on. It's a little more politically radical than ISNA. ISNA is much more of, it's the larger of the two. It embraces both religious leadership as well as professional leadership in business and so on. And they have an annual convention. I actually attended several times. The annual convention is always held over Labor Day weekend, and they get some 20,000 people to attend. The two that I attended were held here in the Chicago area at the Hyatt Regency by O'Hare. But they are the two main Islamic organizations in this country, and including Canada. There is also something called the Council of Mosques. It's a looser, smaller organization, obviously, but given its name, it's primarily religious-based. But that's one of the sometimes challenges that the Islamic community face. They do not have highly organized national structures. The only two really are CARE and ISNA, but they do not have anything that replicates, say, Catholic dioceses or Protestant denominational apparatus. Each mosque is more or less independent, and they vary a lot in, for example, how they approach women. That still remains a big issue in Islamic mosques, certainly at the prayer time and so on. There's a mosque on 47th Street, just on the border between Hyde Park and Kenwood. Beautiful building that was opened about 10 years ago. And I'm told that most Muslims are not welcome in that mosque. The vast majority of Muslims are not considered holy enough to enter the doors of that particular mosque. So there are lots of divisions. I just want to make the point that Islam is a complex entity, as complex as Christianity or Judaism or many of the other religious communities. Now, what does Islam believe? Well, just to try to summarize, and of course, again, there are interpretations. The major Islamic university, Al-Azhar in Cairo, which is sort of the, I don't know, you might say it's the Gregorian or the Catholic view of Islam. But it's in many ways, the professors there, most of whom are imams and so on, will determine how teachings in the Quran are to be applied, particularly in the contemporary world, and so on. So there is that kind of reality as well. The term Islam itself means basically submission, but also can mean peace and even safety or security. But submission is really the key term. Religious Muslims have a really strong sense of dependency on God, a kind of almost humble approach to God, and so on. And that's why I think many Islamic scholars see what ISIS does as so contrary to the fundamental spirit of Islam, because you're not supposed to be aggressive in that kind of way. But the basic meaning of Islam is submission. Now, of course, Islam considers itself monotheistic. It has a belief in one God. There's no question that Muhammad drew his ideas about religion, including about God and so on, from both Christianity and Judaism. Because Christianity and Judaism are seen as forerunners of the final revelation given to Muhammad. Now it's interesting, because I remember many years ago I was teaching in a summer program at the what is called the Ecumenical Institute at Tantur near Jerusalem, which is under the aegis of the University of Notre Dame. And we were having a summer seminar on the four major religious traditions of the Jerusalem region, and that would be Eastern and Western Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. Now, Jerusalem is not a great center of Islamic learning, so it's hard to find any local people who kind of are on the same standard as many of the Christians and Jews in the region. But we did manage to find a teacher, a primary or secondary school teacher, who was quite willing. He was not terribly open to dialogue, but he was open enough to say, yes, I will come to your classes and explain the basic teaching of Islam. And one evening, right after supper, I was walking down the corridor, and he was engaged in a pretty intense discussion with a Catholic sister. Now, it was not hostile, but it was just, you could tell it was rather intense. And as I was passing, he said to the sister, "But sister, you must understand that Christianity has wonderful teachings, but they just missed the final boat." Well, I kind of had a smile, because that's traditionally what we Christians have said to the Jews, that they have, in our better times, that they have some fine teachings, but they missed the final. Well, her eyes were sort of like, 5 feet from her head. She wasn't used to hearing something like that. But that is really, there's no question. In fact, there have been some scholars who have actually claimed that Muhammad had some Jewish roots. That's never been really proven, but clearly he picked up. And his early relationships with Christians and Jews were not hostile. He did not see the founding of the Islamic religion as really a kind of hostile, negative attack on Christianity and Judaism. As a result, Islam does incorporate both the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament, and the New Testament into its basic faith perspective. Now, the interpretations they give to certain sections would differ significantly in some cases from what Christians or Jews might, how Christians and Jews might interpret things, but nonetheless, they do incorporate it. There's also an interesting, Jesus is seen as one of the messengers, because while Islam puts its strong focus on monotheism, even almost more than, in some ways, than Christianity, it's kind of interesting, because in some ways, Islam and Judaism are closer than either one is to Christianity, because Christianity has this Trinitarian approach to God, and in a sense, both Islam and Judaism reject that. And one of the prayers of, probably if there's a central prayer in Judaism, it is what is called the Shema, recited at every worship service, affirming the unity and closeness of God to the people. And Islam has something similar. It's a different wording, but they also have such an affirmation, and that's what you hear people recite. So often, when a Muslim speaker gets up to address an audience, they will say in Arabic this prayer, but it's very similar to the Jewish Shema. And it's a fundamental affirmation of the unity, the oneness of God. The only thing they add is that Muhammad is the authentic interpreter of the revelation from God. It was kind of interesting. I was, many years ago, I was involved in a trilateral conference at the University of Salamanca in Spain. And we had a Christian, Jewish, and Muslim speaker on every panel. And I was on one of the panels, and the Muslim speaker was the imam of this huge, the largest mosque in Europe, the Central Mosque in the city of London. And we got into a discussion about what is called interpreting or exegeting the scriptures. And he said, well, I can understand why Jews and Christians have to spend time, studying the historical background of text, the literary background and all that. He said, I can understand, he said. But we Muslims don't have to do that because, the scriptures were given, the Old Testament took perhaps 1,000 years or more to come together. The New Testament probably took close to a century to come together. But Muhammad got the whole revelation in 8 days. So there's no need to go into any kind of historical interpretation and so on. Well, I'm not sure that's entirely accurate, but that was sort of the perspective. Now, so there is that strong belief in one God, but there are messengers from God. The first messenger was Adam. Muhammad was the final messenger. One of the things that really does, I'll use the word irritate, many Muslims, is when Christians kind of put Jesus and Muhammad on a kind of same plane or something. They do, because they do not see Muhammad as in any way divine. He is solely a messenger from God. Jesus, their view of Jesus is that he likewise was a messenger. Interestingly enough, and this may be of particular interest to Servites, actually Mary is mentioned more in the Quran than she is in the New Testament. Now, the appearance of Mary in Islam tends to be fairly regional. Now, what do I mean by that? You generally find her mentioned mostly in those parts of the world where Islam has interacted with Christianity, such as in Egypt. In those countries where there is virtually no Christian presence, you do not find Mary being any kind of even significant figure in this Islamic expression. So it seems to be the result of some cross-fertilization between a Christian community and the Muslim community in particular regions. Islam also has a strong belief in angels and also in divine revelation, as I've already said. I mean, the teachings of Islam are not just human creations, they were written down by Muhammad, who heard them directly from God. So that's how they're understood. But they also believe it's sort of in the end of days, very similar, their view of, that there's going to be a final judgment and so on. And somehow the world is still going on towards a final religious culmination. They have a belief that all good and evil is decreed by God, and they believe that it's not accidental. So it's a kind of interesting approach to the question of evil, because that's a perennial religious issue. How is there evil in the world, and what does God sanction evil? Does he simply sit back and let it happen? For Muslims, their sense is much more that actually evil is somehow decreed by God. And they also have a belief in life after death. So this is also a major belief. So you can see that a lot of the beliefs are very similar, at least in some ways, to both Christianity and Judaism, and so on. They do not have any sort of completely new, totally kind of unique beliefs. In that sense, and that's why we kind of often refer to the Christianity, Judaism, and Islam as part of the Abrahamic family, that they all owe their origins to, in some way, to Abraham. Now frankly, that's a very disputed question within the scholarship. Many Jews and Muslims and Christians do not feel that while, yes, all three speak about Abraham and in some ways see their origins in Abraham, their understanding of that Abrahamic tradition is quite different as you move from one community to another. But that's more of a scholarly. Yes. Okay.
You mentioned Abraham, and then I think of the God of Abraham, and then I think of our Trinitarian God, and then I have the question, do all three religions worship the same God?
Well, that's, it's an interesting question, and it came up in the Christian-Jewish dialogue a few years ago, because there was a document issued, it had a Hebrew title, Dabru Emet, to speak the truth or speaking the truth. It was composed essentially by 4 Jewish scholars working out of the, at that time, Christian-Jewish Center in Baltimore, with the assistance of a 5th Jewish scholar. But then the document was signed by some more than 200 rabbis, and the people who framed it were ranged from quite conservative to quite progressive in their interpretation of Judaism. And they published a full-page ad in the New York Times with their conclusions, their major conclusions. And one of their major conclusions stated that Jews and Christians believe in the same God. That caused considerable discussion within the Jewish community, and there are some people who would have signed the document but says they could not because of that statement. And that really comes down to the Trinitarian interpretation of God that has been central to Christianity. But then it's a question of how you're going to interpret the Trinitarian interpretation of God. And because, Judaism has a sense of the Spirit. Islam, I'm told, also has some sense of the Spirit. there's now a little bit of exploration going on in Jewish theology about what is termed incarnationalism in Judaism. Now, there's a number of Jewish scholars now that are finding some evidence in parts of the Jewish tradition, particularly the Jewish mystical tradition, that could be labeled as incarnationalism. This is also true in the Hasidic Jewish tradition, which is the Hasidic Jewish tradition is again the more spiritual tradition, which in some ways is very, very similar for Judaism as to what Sufism is for Islam. But it's not that a huge number of Jewish scholars are talking about incarnationalism, but there's a new book out, a fairly new book by a professor named Shaul Magid, who speaks of incarnationalism in Judaism, even though he makes some distinction from how Christians interpret incarnationalism relative to Jesus Christ. But he's willing to use the word, and he said that actually what he's arguing that this is a very old tradition, but that it was buried by after Constantine's conversion to Christianity. It was sort of buried by the Jewish religious leaders because they wanted to keep a sharp distinction between Judaism and Christianity. And their fear was that if this notion of incarnationalism, which you find in Jewish more mystical writings, were to become prominent, it might blur the boundaries, and Jews might figure, okay, it's okay to go over to Christianity. So anyway, it's a little more complicated there. Now there are only two holidays in Islam. One is Eid, which comes at the very end, and the U.S. Postal Service now actually issues a stamp for Eids every year. And it comes at the end of Ramadan. Now, Ramadan is a month of fasting for Muslims. Usually, it always occurs sometime, at least during the summer season in this part of the world. And basically, for the entire 30 days of Ramadan, Muslims fundamentally do not eat all day, or very little. And that's why you have this practice of the so-called breaking of the fast. Once sundown occurs, they can break the fast and have a meal each day. And oftentimes, this is where many Muslim communities now will invite Christians and other religious people to share in the breaking of the fast. I've done that a number of occasions. Cardinal George used to go every year they used to be invited every year to some mosque for the breaking of the fast. But it's a special ritual, but it occurs, usually they emphasize the breaking of the fast as in terms of bringing other people in towards the end of Ramadan, as Ramadan is ending. And right after the last day of Ramadan, so when sundown occurs on the final day of Ramadan, there's usually big parties. So there's a super party that occurs. Ramadan is not it's I suppose you could call it penitential, but it doesn't have the same sort of ethos as, say, Lent would have, particularly. But it is primarily revolves around a fast. Now, the other feast day in Islam is at the time of the Hajj. Now, I don't know if you know what the Hajj is. The Hajj is the pilgrimage to Mecca. Now, every male Muslim is sort of expected once in their lifetime to make this pilgrimage. I don't know what the statistics are. There have been some problems even with overcrowding and so on. But at the end of the Hajj, when the annual Hajj time, if you want, comes to an end, that's also considered a festival day. So the Hajj remains an important goal for Muslims, and quite a few do it. But it's not cheap to get on a plane and travel to Saudi Arabia. Book a hotel for a number of days and participate in it. So, and not everyone can physically do it, but it is considered something that should be done by every male. Now, will they ever get to the point where women will be also included? Who knows? We'll see. There is a slow movement towards upgrading the status of women in Islam, but by and large, at least in religious practice, if one goes, like when I was at the prayer service that I mentioned in Nashville just a few weeks ago, the women still sat over in a corner by themselves, and so on. And in that way, it's not dissimilar to what Orthodox, especially ultra-Orthodox Jews do with respect to women in their services. So, both of them do not. Well, it's not quite the same. There's stuff to be done, but it's come a long way compared to Orthodox Judaism and Islam. Now, in both Orthodox Judaism and in Islam, particularly in the Western world, there are women's movements arguing for, certainly on the Jewish side, there's an effort led by someone that I know, actually, trying to get women ordained as rabbis. I mean, women are ordained as rabbis by conservative and Reform Jews, but not by Orthodox Jews. Now, I can go back to many years. I mentioned that conference in Salamanca that I participated in. Well, on that panel, that imam from the Central Mosque in London did make the statement that he felt that there was absolutely nothing in the Quran that prohibited a woman from serving as an imam. That it was a pure cultural prohibition, if you want to call it that, but there was no legal prohibition against. Now, look, he comes from, I say, a highly westernized mosque in London, so his view is certainly not the accepted one in places like Saudi Arabia or Iran, Iraq, and so on. So, but you can see this kind of gradual, slow development that is taking place in certain parts of Islam. Just a word about jihad, because it's so often, I would say, used and misused. Jihad is not holy war. What it really means is an effort to make society walk in the way of God from the Muslim. Now, is it used by certain groups sort of as a basis for holy war? Yes. I mean, I think there's no denying it. But there's enough Muslim scholars who certainly have argued that in itself that is not the meaning. It's not all that different from what for example, the document Gaudium et Spes on the church in the modern world from Vatican II said when it talked about the need to try to evangelize culture. I mean, that was one of the real strong points of Gaudium et Spes, that we must engage in the evangelization of culture. Now, that doesn't mean an imposition of Catholic beliefs necessarily on society, but it does mean trying to bring the values of Christianity, Catholicism to bear on societal life and practice. So really, that's what jihad ultimately means. Do some abuse the meaning? Yes. But nonetheless, in its pure sense, that's what it means. It's an effort to try to bring the way of God, as Muslims understand it, to have an impact on social behavior in the world. Now, let me just see what time it is. Let me just try to conclude with some final remarks about, you might say, Christian-Muslim dialogue. Christian-Muslim dialogue was, in one way or another, mandated by the same document from Vatican II that mandated Catholic-Jewish dialogue. The document known in Latin as Nostra Aetate in our time. Nostra Aetate is a document of 4 chapters. The 4th chapter is the chapter on the Church's relationship with the Jewish people. The 3rd chapter is on the Church's relationship with Islam. Now, the movement to include a section in that document on Islam was slow in coming, if you want. Actually, when the council was called by John the 23rd, and the original agenda for the council was announced, there was no document plan on interreligious relations. And then there was this historic meeting between John the 23rd and a French Jewish historian named Jules Isaac, who lost most of his family in the Holocaust. And in that discussion, Jules Isaac convinced John the 23rd that in fact there needed to be some statement on the Jews made on Christian-Jewish relations made by the council. And so the Pope ordered Cardinal Bea to begin drafting a document which in Latin was known as De Judaeis, on the Jews, concerning the Jews. But then as it went through the conciliar discussion process, a number of the bishops and so on in the council said, well, first of all, we come from countries where the church exists in Muslim-dominated areas, and we have found some rich interaction with our Muslim brothers and sisters, and we think that should be reflected in this document. Also, some of the bishops from the Middle East said, we can't go home with the document only on the Jews. They already said, you know, our small churches, Christian churches in many of the Muslim-dominated countries are disappearing and so on. And if we go home with just the document on the Jews, it's going to make the situation worse. And as a result, a chapter was added on the importance of Christianity's relationship with Islam. The first chapter of Nostra Aetate is kind of a generic statement about interreligious relations from a Catholic point of view, and the second chapter does also make some mention of other religious traditions, Buddhism, Hinduism, and so on, but not in such a developed fashion as either the Jewish part or and to a lesser extent the Muslim part. So that's kind of the basis for the Catholic Church's current dialogue with Islam. Concretely, here in the United States, the Bishops' Conference has, for the last number of years, had 3 regional dialogues with Muslim leaders. one in the East, one in the Midwest, and one in the West. Within the last few months, an announcement has been made about the creation of a new national Catholic-Muslim dialogue. And the chair of that dialogue is Archbishop Blaise Cupich. Now, I have to tell you that on some of the Catholic blogs, both the Bishops' Conference and Archbishop Cupich have been vilified beyond belief. That the Catholic Church is beginning a dialogue supposedly with terrorists, with Islamicists, and so on. None, of course, of that is true, but we'll see how this new national dialogue does go. It's certainly, I'd have to say, not uncontroversial within contemporary Catholicism. One of the major documents for Catholic-Muslim dialogue came out after, some of you may remember that Benedict XVI gave a speech about Islam and Christianity, which caused a great deal of consternation to many Muslims. But the response of some of the Muslim leaders was not simply to criticize, but to produce a very interesting document which came basically out of Al-Azhar University in Cairo, which is the religious center. If there is a religious center of Islam, it is that university, called the Common Word. And it's been used on the international level as a basis for thinking about Christian-Muslim relations in a more especially in a more theological vein, not just say a practical social vein. The Pope Francis has certainly given impetus. It's not that he has said, in a kind of given a lot of formal statements on Catholicism and Islam, but he certainly has encouraged interreligious dialogue. And, Francis is more of a pope of gesture rather than text. That's not to say he doesn't have text, including the most recent one. But he particularly likes gestures, and he certainly he's washed the feet of Muslims on Holy Thursday and so on. These gestures indicate a basic respect. That doesn't mean, we don't disagree in some key areas, but nonetheless, we start out with the basic attitude of respect. To close then, I'd just like to introduce you to the most recent statement from the Muslim side. This is not specifically a Catholic Muslim, but it is back in the fall, after much planning over several years, there was a major conference held in Marrakesh in Morocco. Now, one has to say that in terms of the Islam practiced in Morocco and Tunisia has tended to be much more open to other religious traditions than what you may find, what you certainly find in Saudi Arabia or some other countries. But the organizers of the Marrakesh conference brought together some 250 Muslim scholars from various parts of the world. And they also invited about 50 non-Muslims, Christians, other religious leaders, and so on, as observers to this process. And over a period of days, they finalized what is now known as the Marrakesh Declaration. It's just basically 2 pages. And let me just, the fundamental issue is, what are the rights of non-Muslims in Muslim-dominated society? And here are the basic affirmations on that point by the Marrakesh document. I have some, I wasn't there, but I have some personal witness to it because the current chair of the Parliament of the World's Religions, Professor Robert Sellers, was invited to be one of the Christian participants, and he's come back and briefed us on the board of the Parliament about what went on, and very positively. So they have an introduction and so on, but they then go say, "We thereby affirm, we call upon Muslim scholars and intellectuals around the world to develop a jurisprudence of the concept of citizenship, which is inclusive of diverse groups. Such jurisprudence shall be rooted in Islamic tradition and principles and mindful of global changes." 2, we urge Muslim educational institutions and authorities to conduct a courageous review of educational curricula that addresses honestly and effectively any material that instigates aggression and extremism, leads to war and chaos, and results in the destruction of our shared societies. 3, we call upon politicians and decision makers to take the political and legal steps necessary to establish a constitutional contractual relationship among its citizens, and to support all formulations and initiatives that aim to fortify relations and understanding among the various religious groups that live in the Muslim world. Next, we call upon the educated, the artistic, and creative members of our societies, as well as organizations of civil society, to establish a broad movement for the just treatment of religious minorities in Muslim countries, and to raise awareness as to their rights and to work together to ensure the success of these efforts. Next, we call upon the various religious groups bound by the same national fabric to address their mutual state of selective amnesia that blocks memories of centuries of joint and shared living on the same land. We call upon them to rebuild the past by reviving the tradition of conviviality and restoring our shared trust that has been eroded by extremists using acts of terror and aggression. And finally, we call upon representatives of the various religions, sects, and denominations to confront all forms of religious bigotry, vilification, and denigration of what people hold sacred, as well as all speech that promotes hatred and bigotry. And finally, we affirm that it is unconscionable to employ religion for the purpose of aggressing upon the rights of religious minorities in Muslim countries. Now, is this the law of the land in most Muslim-dominated countries? Not yet. And so the real challenge is, will this vision set out by some 250 Muslim leaders, mostly religious leaders, take hold in Islamic societies? We shall have to see. But it is certainly a challenge, and it, in certain countries, it's already taken hold up to a point, and particularly in places like Morocco and Tunisia, and so on. So I think it's a hopeful sign. I think at this point, we as Christians have to be prepared to work with Islamic leaders, both religious and secular, who are open to dialogue. There's also an interesting growing Jewish-Muslim dialogue that's taking place right now, including educational programming and so on. So let us see if that can make a difference. Look, the Marrakesh Declaration is not going to be adopted by the ISIS state. That we know. So, how we confront the extremism, which is really there, we can't deny it, we can't pretend it's not there, I think remains a real challenge. But at least, there are many people who say, well, Muslims just want to kill everybody or something. And simply there's no sense of the kind of developments that are taking place. The media doesn't rejoice in publicizing positive news from the Islamic community. And that's one of the, and this really frustrates many Muslim leaders, and even in groups like ISNA and CARE, because they say, people tell us, well, you never say anything publicly again. We say it, but no one listens. The media doesn't pick it up, and promote it. But if ISIS says something, or some more radical Islamic group says something, they'll certainly be in top billing on the news media and so on. So thank you very much. I hope that's given you some sense of Islam. I'm willing to take some questions if someone has some.
Isn't it true that in what they call the golden age of Islam in Baghdad and even Cordova and places like that, the Christians and Jews lived together with Islamic people? And for example, the churches of the East, the Nestorian churches, had their seminaries and everything in what is now Persia or beyond. And you get the impression that the Islamic leaders had Jewish advisors and Christian advisors.
Some of this, and the document, the Marrakesh document, does make some allusion to that reality, and say, let's bring it back. This is what we're calling for is not totally new. There are these instances. There is, of course, the so-called Golden Age in Spain.
Yeah.
I was at a conference in Spain some years ago. Actually, it was at what had been the Moroccan Pavilion at the World's Fair in Seville. And there was, the scholars are in some disagreement as to how golden that age really was, number one. And number two, how widespread, was it kind of confined to an intellectual academic elite? But I think there's evidence that on the ground there were, in many cases, very good relations and so on. Our preaching, the Christian preaching of the Crusades didn't help a lot.
No.
In terms of engendering. So, it's not necessarily a one-way street in terms of blame for the breakdown of that. But it's and there are efforts in places like the Philippines and so on, where you have a Muslim minority in parts of the Philippines. There's been a real effort. One of my Filipino students at CTU, a young priest,